Hello friends, I'm really glad you're here tonight. Wherever you've settled in, whatever kind of day it's been, welcome. I'm happy you made it. Tonight we're going somewhere very specific. A room in England, stone walls, heavy curtains, the smell of beeswax candles and dried herbs in the rushes on the floor. Outside the door there are people, a lot of them. Your family, his family, the priest, the wedding guests, still warm from a feast that's been going 3 hours and is apparently not entirely over. You can hear them laughing, moving, getting closer. You are the bride. You're 16 years old, and you have known this moment was coming for longer than you can remember. Here's what most people don't know about the Tudor wedding night. It wasn't private. Not in the way we'd think of privacy today. Not in any way, really. The crowd outside that door is coming in. That was the custom. The bedding ceremony, they called it. A procession of guests and family members would escort the couple to the bridal chamber. They would undress them both, help them into bed, and raise a toast with spiced wine. And in many aristocratic households, a priest would enter the room to bless the bed. While the couple lay in it, think about that, a priest, standing at your bedside on your wedding night, saying a prayer. But here's the part that surprises people even more. The night itself was almost the least of what you had lost that day, because the moment you said those vows at the altar, something shifted, quietly, legally, permanently. You stopped being a person. In the eyes of English law, a married woman had simply ceased to exist. We're going to talk about all of it tonight. The ceremony, the law, the fear that had nothing to do with innocence and everything to do with knowing exactly what was coming. We'll sit with some of the women who lived it. One who wrote her child a letter she never expected to deliver, and 2 queens whose wedding nights shaped English history in ways nobody predicted. Before we go any further, I want to say something. Late at night, after these go up, I open the comments. I don't have a system for it. It's just something I do, and the ones I keep coming back to are always the ones with a place and a time in them. Someone in their bedroom at midnight. Someone on a couch in a city I'll probably never visit. It makes the whole thing feel less like a video and more like company. So tell me where you are tonight, and what time is it there? Now, dim those lights a little if you can. Let the room get softer. Let everything from today stay where it is just for now. You don't need it anymore tonight. Let the covers settle. Let the room get quieter. And let's go back, 4.5 centuries, give or take, to a world where the most important night of a woman's life began long before any door ever opened. The fear didn't start on the wedding night. That's the first thing to understand. It started months before, sometimes years. And for women born into certain families, the titled families, the families with estates to protect and alliances to form, it started in childhood. Long before the word husband meant anything beyond an arrangement being worked out by men, with account books and a very firm sense of what the future should look like. In Tudor England, marriage was not a personal decision. It was a business negotiation, and the bride was, in many respects, the inventory. That sounds harsh. It was meant warmly, which, as compliments go, only gets you so far. Let's begin with the law. The law is where everything begins. Marriage in Tudor England was governed by canon law, the law of the church. Under it, the minimum legal age for a girl to marry was 12. For boys, it was 14, 12 years old. If you want to feel the weight of that number, just sit with it for a moment. Now, something important tends to get lost here, and it's worth saying clearly. For most Tudor women, women from ordinary families, farmers' daughters, tradesmen's daughters, women with no estate to negotiate and no title to protect. Marriage happened much later. The historical record suggests that common women in England typically married in their mid to late 20s. They waited until there was enough money to establish a household. They had some say in the matter, within limits. But for noble families the calculation was different. Daughters of the aristocracy were betrothed, sometimes while still children, as part of alliances that had nothing to do with the feelings of the young people involved. Everything to do with land, titles, political protection, the careful management of debts across generations. A useful marriage, meaning a strategically useful one, could solve in an afternoon what years of conflict had failed to settle, and so the negotiations began, not with the couple, with their fathers, their uncles, their family representatives, the men in the room who understood what was actually at stake. These negotiations were exhaustive. Families would review each other's assets, land records, livestock, the state of the estate buildings, the outstanding debts. The goal was to arrive at two numbers that balanced each other. The first was the dowry. The dowry was what the bride's family brought to the match: money, land, goods, livestock, sometimes all of the above. It was an early release of the daughter's inheritance. You are handing over a portion of your family's wealth. What you received in return was an alliance, a connection, and a daughter placed and, in theory, protected. The second number was the jointure. The jointure was the provision the groom's family agreed to make for the bride if her husband died before her. Her insurance, the income or property that would support her as a widow. This number mattered enormously, because widowhood, as we'll come to understand, was one of the only conditions in which a Tudor woman had any real legal standing at all. You'll notice that the only thing anyone was negotiating for on your behalf was what happened to you after your husband died, not what happened to you during the marriage, after. These two numbers had to balance to the satisfaction of both families. If they didn't, negotiations stretched on for months. If they broke down entirely, the match didn't happen and everyone went back to looking. The people conducting these negotiations were professionals at it. By the Tudor period, there was a well-established practice around marriage negotiations among the nobility. Lawyers specialized in drawing up marriage contracts. Agents assessed the condition of estates. Advisors knew the dynamics of specific families and could advise on where there was room to press and where there was not. A great family entering marriage negotiations did not send in amateurs. The documents produced were correspondingly detailed. A marriage contract specified not just the dowry and jointure figures, but the precise form they would take, which parcels of land, which revenues, what would happen to each specific asset in each specific circumstance. What happened to a property if the bride died without heirs? What happened if she died after having children but before her husband? What happened if the groom died insolvent? The contingencies were spelled out with the care of people who understood that the future would not necessarily cooperate with the present, and who had enough experience of estates going wrong to plan for it. Some contracts also specified elements of the marriage itself, whether the couple would live with the groom's family or establish a separate household, how many servants the bride would be entitled to bring with her, what obligations the groom's family had toward her maintenance in the event of disagreement with her husband. These provisions were not common in all contracts, but they appear frequently enough to indicate that families, particularly families with daughters who had significant assets to protect, thought carefully about what was being agreed to. The betrothal ceremony that preceded the wedding had its own formal character. It was not a private understanding between two young people. It was a legal ceremony conducted before witnesses. The terms of the forthcoming marriage were publicly acknowledged. The couple made an explicit promise, a de futuro contract, a promise of future marriage, that created a legally binding obligation on both parties. Breaking the betrothal, after this ceremony, was not simply a social difficulty. It was a breach of contract with real legal consequences. In some cases, the betrothal was celebrated with a small feast, gifts, and the exchange of rings. In others, it was a more purely legal ceremony, lawyers present, witnesses recorded, documents signed. In either case, the effect was the same. The arrangement had been made public. The obligations had been undertaken. The path toward the wedding was now formal, and the girl who had stood through that ceremony, who had said the words, accepted the ring, and smiled at the guests, went home. She began the waiting that would end at the altar. She was not consulted further about the terms. The terms had been decided. She had agreed to what the ceremony required her to agree to. The rest was already settled, in the documents that the lawyers had drawn up and the men of both families had signed. The church technically required consent from both parties. A marriage, to be valid, had to be entered into freely, by two people who agreed to it. In theory. In practice, the consent of a 12-year-old girl was, at best, a formality. Her father had spent months in negotiation. The family's position depended on the outcome. She had been told since childhood that this was her duty and her role. The pressure wasn't always unkind. Many fathers genuinely believed they were securing their daughters' futures. In their world, love was expected to follow commitment rather than precede it. They were acting, in good faith, within the only framework they knew. But expectation and experience are different things, and the girl standing at the altar had not, in most cases, chosen the man beside her. She had been delivered to him, and she knew, with whatever intelligence she'd brought to the situation, exactly what that delivery meant. The betrothal itself was a formal legal ceremony, predating the wedding, sometimes by years. Breaking it was not simply a matter of changing your mind. Financial penalties and lasting social damage were both real possibilities. Once the arrangements were made, the path was set. There was very little room to step off it. And so the dread that built in a young woman's chest, that quiet, accumulating knowledge of what her wedding night would eventually require, had months, sometimes years, to grow. She didn't wake on her wedding morning and suddenly confront it. She had been living alongside it. It was a companion she couldn't put down and couldn't outrun, and could only eventually walk through. The years between the betrothal and the ceremony were not, for most girls, years of passive waiting. They were years of preparation, active, directed, constant preparation for the role they were being given. A young woman of the nobility in those years was being educated in the specific skills her new household would require. Household management, the supervision of servants, the management of food supplies, the care of the linen, the keeping of household accounts. Music in many families, the lute or the virginals, enough to contribute to the entertainment of an evening. French in households where it was considered important, and sometimes a little Latin. The social skills, how to receive guests, how to manage a seating arrangement, how to conduct the particular kind of conversation that keeps a room comfortable without revealing more of yourself than is wise. Needlework, always needlework, not simply as a pastime but as genuine productive work. The making and repair of linens and clothing represented real economic value in a household. A woman who was competent in it could contribute materially from the first week of her marriage. She was learning to run the life she was about to be given. In some households, a betrothed girl would spend time in her future husband's house before the ceremony. She served as a gentlewoman to the wife of a senior relation. She learned the rhythms of a large establishment, met the servants, and became familiar with the spaces she was about to inhabit. A practical kindness. It changed nothing about the legal reality that awaited her. But it meant that when the ceremony was over and the guests had gone and the house had gone quiet, there was at least one room she had seen before, one corridor she had walked, one face she recognized without having to place it. For others, there was no such preparation. The arrangements were made, the date was set, and you arrived at your wedding having met your husband perhaps twice, sometimes not at all. What you had been given, regardless, was an understanding of what was expected. This is the version of preparation that is harder to teach and easier to absorb. The knowledge that comes from growing up in a world where the women around you have all done exactly what you are about to do. Their experience is the texture of the air you breathe. You didn't have to be told everything explicitly. You could see it. You could feel it in the particular weight of the attention that was placed on you in the months before the wedding. The extra care taken with your hair, the way your mother looked at you sometimes when she thought you weren't noticing. She was checking on you. She was watching to see how you were carrying it. The answer, for most girls, was this: quietly. The same way you carried most things in a life where the principal skill required was not to avoid difficult things, but to move through them with composure intact. And in the last days before the wedding, when the date was no longer an abstraction but a fact, something changed. The dress was finished. The preparations were complete. The only thing remaining was the event itself. There was a specific quality to that waiting, hard to describe, easy to recognize. The mind can reason about what's coming, can contextualize, can reassure itself with the survival of the women who went before. The body does something different. It simply knows that something large is approaching, and it responds accordingly. The interrupted sleep, the appetite that arrives and disappears, the way you become conscious of your own breathing. You notice everything in those last days, the texture of the wall, the sound of the fire settling, the smell of the bread from the kitchen below. When the mind is bracing for something, it tends to attend with particular care to the present moment, as if storing it up, as if the details of the ordinary world have more value when they're about to be left behind. You noticed everything. The day kept coming toward you regardless. The women of Tudor England were not naive about what marriage required. They grew up in close quarters, with animals, with siblings sharing beds, with servants who talked freely, with older women who explained things directly when the time came. They understood the physical reality of what a wedding night meant. What they feared was not the unknown. What they feared was the known. Marriage was a door that, once opened, could not be closed. It changed your name, your address, your legal status, your financial situation, your body, almost certainly within the year. The wedding night was not a single event to endure and be done with. It was an entrance, a first step into a life arranged entirely by other people, according to rules that had nothing to do with what you wanted. You may recognize this feeling in some quieter version, this sense of standing at the edge of something permanent, the knowledge that the person on one side of a threshold is different from the person on the other. For a Tudor woman of the nobility, this wasn't a metaphor, it was a legal fact, documented, binding, and yet most of them went, They dressed in their finest clothes. They stood at the altar. They said the words. They ate the feast, played their role in the procession, and eventually walked through that bedroom door. Not because they felt no fear, but because fear, in Tudor England, was not a reason to stop. It was simply the weather. You dressed appropriately and went outside anyway. Some families tried to ease the transition. It was not unusual for a betrothed girl to spend time in her future husband's household before the ceremony, meeting the servants, learning the rhythms of the house, becoming at least familiar with the world she was about to inhabit. A practical kindness. It changed nothing about the legal reality, but it gave the girl something to recognize when the ceremony was over. A room she'd seen before, a face she'd spoken with more than once. For others, there was no such preparation. The arrangements were made, the date was set, and you arrived at your wedding having met your husband perhaps twice, sometimes not at all. The marriage contract, drawn up by families and their representatives, specified the dowry amount, the jointure, and what would happen to any property the bride brought to the match. It named the expected heirs. It outlined her protections as a widow. It did not, as a rule, ask how she felt about any of it. She would have known the broad terms, of course. This is what your father arranged. This is what you're entitled to if you outlive him. This is the provision that protects you if things go wrong. The information was delivered as fact, not as negotiation. She was the subject of the document, not a party to it. The wealthiest families could establish legal trust before the ceremony. These careful arrangements sheltered a portion of the bride's property from her husband's legal reach. This was the workaround, the mechanism families with real resources used to protect their daughters. For everyone else, no such protection existed. What you brought to the marriage, you left there. And so the question no document of the era was designed to capture, was simply this. What did it feel like to stand at the beginning of all that? To be 12 years old, or 15 or 18 with everything already decided? To know that in a matter of hours you would be a wife, and that the person you had been until that morning would simply not exist anymore? The answer, where we can find it, lives in letters, in the small private writings of women who managed to record what the official documents never could. What those writings say, again and again, is not despair, though despair was certainly present. What they say, more often, is something quieter, something that sounds like this. I understand what is expected of me. I will do what is expected of me, and I am afraid. Those three things can all live in the same body at the same time. Tudor women knew that better than most, and by the time the wedding morning came, most of them had been carrying all three for a very long time. The day was just beginning, and it had been building toward this particular beginning for months, sometimes years. The contracts were signed, the dress was ready, the negotiations were concluded. The only thing remaining was for the woman at the centre of it all, who'd been the subject of every document, every conversation, every carefully considered arrangement, to walk through the door that had been built for her. She would do it. She had always been going to do it. The question was not whether she would go, but what she would carry with her when she did. And what she carried by that morning was everything. The training and the knowledge and the fear and the quiet, strange tenderness of a family, sending a daughter somewhere she had not chosen. She had been carrying all of it for a very long time. One more day. The night before the wedding, in most households, belonged to the women. The men had completed their work, the negotiations, the contracts, the months of arrangements that had finally settled into a date and a name and a ceremony. That was done. What remained was the quieter business of the evening before, and it was women's work entirely. The women gathered, mothers, aunts, older sisters, female servants who had known the girl since childhood. They would sit together in the late hours, doing the last of the practical things, laying out the wedding dress, checking the veil, preparing the chamber, making sure everything was in order for the morning. The fire burned low, the candles guttered, and somewhere inside all of that preparation the conversation would happen. It happened differently in every household. In some homes, a girl had been told everything years earlier by a mother who believed in preparation and saw no reason to wait. In others, the wedding eve was the first time anyone sat with her and spoke plainly about what the days ahead would require. Not just the ceremony, not just the feast, all of it. What they told her varied. What they gave her, in almost every case, was the same thing: company. The presence of women who had already been through it, who had stood where she was standing, felt what she was feeling, and had walked through the door and come out the other side still standing. That was the comfort on offer. Not false reassurance, not promises that couldn't be honoured, just the quiet fact of their presence and the message that presence carried. You are not the first. You will not be the last. We are here. In wealthier households, there were sometimes gifts, a piece of good fabric, a piece of jewellery the bride could keep, something small and personal that could travel with her into the new house and sit on a dressing table in a strange room, a quiet object that said, "Someone loved you before this. Someone is still thinking of you." She would carry that thought with her. She would need it. The morning came early. The dress was put on, and the work of it took time. This was not a garment you stepped into alone. Hooks, laces, the careful arrangement of embroidered panels that had taken weeks to prepare. Other hands dressed you. Your hair was arranged with ribbons or pearls or flowers depending on the season and the family's means. You stood still while the women moved around you, and the image in the polished metal of the mirror, if there was one, showed you someone who looked entirely the part. The dressing was its own kind of ceremony. The women who did it, your attendants, your mother if she was there, the senior women of the household, worked with the careful attention of people who understood the significance of what their hands were doing. This was not merely getting dressed. This was the last time these particular hands would arrange this particular hair in this particular room for this particular girl who was about to become a woman in a different house, under a different name, belonging to a different family in the eyes of the law. Some of them had dressed brides before. Some of them had been dressed themselves in rooms like this by women who are gone now. The knowledge of what lay ahead of you, not just the ceremony, not just the day, but the years, was in the room with you. It was in the hands that fastened the hooks with practiced precision, in the silence that sat between the women, with the specific weight of things that are known and not said. You stood still, you let them work. This was perhaps the last act of being entirely attended to, of being the centre of this much careful female attention, before the attention of the world shifted from you as a daughter to you as a wife. The transition was hours away, but it had already begun. The dress was extraordinary. It had been designed, fitted and stitched over weeks, with embroidery that had been worked by multiple hands in the evenings, in the firelight, by women who had put their own hours and attention into making it what it was. The fabric was the finest the family could manage, silk in wealthy households, or the richest wool the market offered if silk was beyond reach. The colour depended on the family and the period. White was not yet the convention it would later become. Blue was common, rich red, deep green. Whatever spoke of the family's prosperity and taste, you wore it like armour, not in the sense of hostility, in the sense of protection, something between you and the world that said, I have been prepared for this. I am ready. I know how to do this. That was the skill required today, looking entirely the part. You had been practicing it, in smaller ways, your whole life. The walk to the ceremony was itself a public occasion. In village communities, neighbours gathered along the way. In grander households, the procession moved through the estate grounds, watched by servants and tenants and anyone else with reason to be there. The bride, processing toward her wedding, was not a private person having a private experience. She was a statement. This family is giving their daughter to that family. This alliance is being made. Look at her. You walked. You managed your expression. And if your hands trembled slightly inside the fabric of your gloves, that was your own matter and no one else's. The church was cold. Even in summer, stone churches kept a chill that no number of candles or bodies ever fully defeated. You noticed it when you crossed the threshold, the drop in temperature, the quality of air that has been enclosed for centuries, the smell of incense and damp stone and something older underneath both. The priest was already at the altar. Candles burned along the nave, more than this church would see on an ordinary Sunday, their light warm and unsteady, making the faces in the pews look vivid for a moment, then shifting, then vivid again. The space had a weight to it today that it didn't have on ordinary Sundays. The same walls, a different quality of attention inside them. You had been in this church many times before. You knew its echo, the way sound moved in it. You'd sat in a pew and watched the priest say words over other people. Today, he was saying the words over you. The ceremony itself was shorter than you might have expected given what it was doing. The readings, the responses, the words you had been told to say, which you said clearly because you had been instructed to say them clearly, and because your body was doing everything it had been instructed to do even while your mind existed somewhere slightly above and behind it, watching carefully. Do you take this man? You said yes. The word was not complicated, its consequences were. The groom's voice, when he made his promise, with all my worldly goods I thee endow, was steady. It sounded like a man performing a ceremony he had prepared for. It sounded like you. The ring was cold from the priest's hands. It was placed on your finger, the third finger of the left hand, where the vein was said by some to run directly toward the heart. The metal was new, strange against your skin. Your own hand looked unfamiliar with it on. You were married. The priest closed his book. The congregation exhaled, in the way congregations do when a ceremony completes. A collective release of held attention, a return to ordinary breathing. The formal part was done. You walked back down the nave. The faces in the pews changed as you passed. Something had shifted in them, from the formal attention of witnesses to the warmer attention of people at celebration. Some of them smiled. One older woman near the back caught your eye and held it for a moment with an expression that contained more than could be read in passing. She had been through it. She wanted you to know she remembered. The vows were said. The ring was placed. And among the careful, ancient language of the ceremony, one sentence deserves particular attention. The groom's promise, with this ring I thee wed, with my body I thee worship, and with all my worldly goods I thee endow, was extravagant in its language. He was promising everything, his body, his wealth, all of it. In the same moment, the law outside the church door was quietly preparing to receive everything of hers. The vow and the law occupied different registers and were not expected to explain themselves to each other. The ceremony was about love, God, and eternity. The legal reality was about property. Both were true simultaneously, on the same day, spoken over the same two people. Whether this struck anyone present as contradictory is not something the records tend to note. And then the ceremony was over, and the procession moved toward the hall, and the feast began. Picture the great hall. Not a hallway. A room. The largest room in the house in most cases, and today it held everyone. Long tables set with more food than most people in that room would see in a week. The smell of roasting meat and wood smoke and something sweet from the high table. Sugar shaped into elaborate forms because sugar was expensive enough that displaying it was its own statement. Real wax candles lit even in daylight, because today was not a day for economies of any kind. You're sitting near the head of the table. You're in your finest dress. Your hair is still perfect. People are looking at you with some regularity and making assessments you cannot hear and have no influence over, which is not an entirely new experience. The feast went on for hours. Tudor wedding feasts among wealthy families were extended affairs, multiple courses, entertainment between them, and wine in quantities that increased steadily as the afternoon became evening, and toasts. So many toasts. To the bride, to the groom, to the union, to the heirs, everyone was already quietly anticipating. Each toast was drunk standing, which meant that by the third hour a significant portion of the room had a deep and personal relationship with the contents of their cup. The food itself was a statement. A Tudor wedding feast was a display of everything the family was and wished to appear to be. Whole roasted animals, elaborate pastry constructions, gilded and shaped to impress, spiced dishes from recipes that required imported ingredients, pepper, cinnamon, saffron, things that had cost money in the procuring and money in the cooking and money in the serving, and were set before the guests precisely because they had. The point was not subtle. This was the point. The entertainment came between courses. Musicians played from the gallery or the corner of the room, keeping the energy warm and moving. In some households, poetry was recited, some of it considerably more pointed about the evening ahead than you might have predicted. The groom's companions, in particular, brought considerable enthusiasm to the more specific observations about the wedding night. This was understood as celebratory rather than inappropriate. There was distinction. They were sure of it. The bride smiled at what was expected. She had been smiling at what was expected all day. She was quite accomplished at it by now. From where you were sitting, you could see the whole hall. Not all at once. A great hall fills differently than a smaller room. It clusters at the edges first, conversations gathering near the fire at one end and near the main doors at the other, and the centre tends to be louder than either. From the head of the table you could see the shape of it. The faces nearest to you were the important ones, the family, the senior guests, the people who had been placed there deliberately. Behind them the arrangement became looser, the laughter a little freer, the wine a little less rationed. You could tell how far into the feast it was by how loud the far end of the hall had become. It had become quite loud. The musicians in the gallery were playing a pavan, slow and stately, the kind of music designed to fill a room without dominating it. You'd heard it before at other occasions. It was the sort of piece that could continue for several hours without anyone noticing it had not stopped, which was perhaps the point. Underneath it, the layer of conversation had a texture you could almost see, the rise and fall of voices, the occasional sharp laugh, the low rumble of a table of men talking about things that interested them more than the music. The food had been good. You had eaten less of it than you might have on an ordinary day. This is a thing that happens sometimes. When the body knows something is coming, it turns inward. The roasted meats and the elaborate pastry constructions and the dishes fragrant with cinnamon and saffron and pepper were placed in front of you and removed largely untouched. You had smiled when the servants caught your eye. No one said anything about it. Everyone in this room understood perfectly well what was happening and was kind enough not to mention it. The groom was at your side. He had spoken to you at intervals throughout the feast, courteous in most cases, careful, the way people are careful when they are aware of being observed. You had spoken back with equal care on topics that were easy. The quality of the musicians, the relative excellence of a particular dish that neither of you had eaten much of, the pleasantness of the journey to the church. The conversation had the quality of a performance. You both knew this. You were both doing your best. What he was thinking across the small distance of the table was not something you could read. What he was feeling about the evening ahead, whether it was eagerness or something more complicated, was his own matter, filed behind the same careful expression you were managing on your own side of the table. Two people in the same performance at the same table. The toasts had continued. You had drunk when the cup was raised toward you, because to do otherwise would have been noticed and remarked upon, and there were enough things being noticed and remarked upon already. The wine was good. You could feel it working, the slight softening at the edges of the room, the way the candlelight became warmer, the way the laughter from 3 tables down stopped feeling quite as sharp. This was, you understood, somewhat by design. A man near the centre of the hall was attempting to sing. He was not succeeding in any technical sense, but the effort was being received with warmth, which suggested the wine had been working on the guests as well as on you. The musicians in the gallery paused, listened for a moment, and then resumed with something that nearly matched his key, a professional decision that spoke well of them. You watch the hall, you watch the candles, you watch the servants move between the tables with the quiet efficiency of people whose commitment was to the logistics rather than to the occasion, and you found, in watching them, a kind of rest, something to look at that was simply moving, simply working, asking nothing of you. The light was different now. The candles had burned down into themselves, their warmth deepening, the shadows in the corners growing thicker. The feast was past its peak. The energy in the room had changed from the bright tension of a beginning to something softer, more settled, still animated, no longer sharp, and yet the hour was coming. You did not look at it directly. You held your cup. You listened to the music. You answered the question from the woman to your left. Something about the embroidery on your sleeve, a thread of conversation that was kind in its ordinariness, asking nothing of you that you couldn't give. You were grateful for it in the way that doesn't announce itself, that just settles quietly and stays. The hall was full of people who loved you, or were connected to you, or owed your family something, or simply knew your name and had come to witness this day. They were all here, in their way, all with you, and none of them, when the attendants came, would be walking with you where you were going. There was also, in certain households, the matter of the garter. Guests would attempt to obtain a piece of the bride's garter as a lucky token, a custom observed with varying degrees of enthusiasm depending on the family and the exact state of the wine supply. It was considered participation, community investment in the marriage. The guests were there for a purpose, and they embraced that purpose with warmth. The bride's experience of the custom was not considered its most important element. The candles burned lower. The noise in the hall rose and then gradually began to settle. People had eaten their fill. Some had drunk rather more than their fill, which is a time-honoured wedding tradition that predates the Tudors by several centuries and will presumably continue long after all of us. The conversation grew softer. The musicians shifted to something slower. And then the attendants came. It was time. The feast was the last hour. The door still felt like yours. After that it opened, whether you were ready or not. The procession to the bedchamber was not a quiet affair. This is the moment where almost everyone who imagines a Tudor wedding night gets it wrong. They picture a door closing, two people finally alone, some privacy, some quiet, a chance to breathe. What actually happened was considerably livelier. After the feast, once the signal had been given, the guests did not sit back down and wish the couple well from a respectful distance. They got up, they followed. The entire wedding party, still warm from the feast, still in good spirits, would move through the corridors of the house, candles in hand, voices raised, laughter echoing off the walls, up to the door of the bridal chamber, and then in many households they went inside. The bedding ceremony was a ritual, a formal, entirely sanctioned ritual, and it required participants, not just the couple, the community, the family, the guests, the attendants, the priest, in aristocratic households, all of them present for the first moments of the couple's first night together. Think about what that means, practically speaking. You had just sat through a feast for 3 hours. You'd smiled and made conversation and drunk the toasts and smiled some more. And now you were being escorted by a crowd of people who had watched you at dinner, down a corridor to your bedchamber. The people who had known you your whole life were still watching. They were, if anything, closer. The chamber had been prepared in advance, fresh linens on the bed, dried herbs strewn across the floor, lavender and rosemary for their associations with love and fidelity. The curtains of the bed were heavy, drawn halfway. The candle on the dressing table burned steadily, the same kind of low, quiet light that had been in the room the night before when the women had gathered and offered what comfort they could. The guests entered, not all of them, but enough. The bride's attendants helped her out of her wedding dress carefully, because it was an expensive and carefully made garment, and was not to be treated carelessly even now. The groom's attendants did the same for him. Then the couple were helped into the bed, settled against the pillows, and the assembled company arranged itself around them. The spiced wine was brought, the benediction posset, a hot sweetened drink flavoured with spices meant to warm the body and the spirits. A toast was drunk, more than one probably, and then, in many cases, the priest came forward. The blessing of the bed was a church-sanctioned ritual, a prayer said over the bridal chamber and the couple in it, to sanctify the union and ensure the fruitfulness of the marriage. The priest would say his words, the guests would stand and listen. The couple would lie in the bed they had just been placed in their night clothes, surrounded by family and guests and a man of the cloth, while a prayer was offered. After the blessing, the guests began to withdraw. There was more laughter, the familiar kind, the kind that had been hovering over the evening since the feast. The stockings were thrown from the bed toward the guests, and whoever caught one would, according to popular belief, be the next to marry. This was pursued with some enthusiasm. Let's spend a little longer here, in this room. Because what happened in the minutes between the blessing and the emptying of the chamber is where the experience sits most vividly, and it's the part that's hardest to convey in summary. You were in the bed. You had been placed there by your attendants. They had undressed you with the matter-of-fact efficiency of women who understood that efficiency was kindness in this particular situation, who had helped you out of the wedding dress without ceremony or sentiment, because sentiment was not what the moment required. Your nightclothes were on, your hair was down, the guests were still in the room, and those guests were people you knew. This is the specific quality of the experience that is hardest to carry across the centuries. Not the strangers who might be in such a room. The guests at a great noble wedding could include people the bride had never met, but also, and in most cases predominantly, the people who had known her longest, her aunts, her older cousins, the women who had sat with her the night before and offered what comfort they could, the men who had negotiated her future in the parlour, her father, in some cases. They were all in the room. They were watching with warmth and goodwill and the complete sincerity of people who believed they were participating in something important. Because they were. The bedding ceremony was not a humiliation. It was understood as a celebration, a communal witnessing of a threshold. The community was present because the community had a stake in the marriage. That stake was genuine, none of which changed what it felt like to be the person in the bed. The groom was beside you, equally placed there by his attendants, equally in his nightclothes, equally the subject of the assembled company's warm and slightly wine-warmed attention. His experience of this moment was not the same as yours, but he was present in it with you, which was something, and he was presumably navigating his own version of the situation as best he could. The priest's words, when he came forward, had a specific quality in a room like this, a room that was not a church, where the liturgical language landed differently than it did in the nave, quieter in a way, more pointed. You could hear every word clearly because the room was small enough that you were close to him. The words were about fruitfulness and sanctification, and the blessing of the union, and they were directed at the two of you, and everyone in the room was very still while he said them. When he finished, someone began to laugh, not unkindly, just the natural release of a room full of people who'd been solemn for a moment, and were ready to not be solemn anymore. The energy shifted, the stockings were thrown, there was noise, there was movement. People began to make their way toward the door, still talking, still laughing, carrying the candles, and gradually the sound got further away. You could hear them in the corridor, then further down the corridor, then. And this part took longer than you might have expected because groups of people with wine in them do not move efficiently. Finally, not at all. And then, gradually, the room emptied. The voices faded down the corridor. The last candle was carried out. The door was pulled closed. The couple were alone. The candle on the dressing table still burned, quietly, behind the heavy velvet curtain of the bed. A small flame in a suddenly silent room, and the night that had been anticipated and dreaded and prepared for and talked around and not talked about and prayed over and negotiated toward for months, sometimes years. The night was just beginning. Most people, when they hear this, assume the fear was about the obvious thing, the physical intimacy, the unfamiliarity, the not knowing what to expect. But here's what the historical evidence suggests, again and again, and here's what gets lost when the story is simplified down to a single night and a single door. The women of Tudor England were not naive. They knew, in practical terms, what the wedding night required. What they understood, and what they had been understanding with growing clarity for much of their lives, was what followed, not the night, the years after it, because the wedding night was not the source of the terror. The wedding night was simply the moment when everything else became irreversible. It was the moment when the pregnancy clock started. And pregnancy, in Tudor England, in the 16th century, among women of every class and every rank, was where the real fear lived. But before we get there, before the childbed and the prayers and the extraordinary women who faced all of it, there is something about the night itself that deserves more attention, something about why it was witnessed, why a priest came into your bedchamber, why the law cared so specifically about what happened in that room on that particular night. Because the bedding ceremony wasn't spectacle for its own sake, it was evidence. Consummation, the physical completion of the marriage, was, under English and canon law, the act that made a marriage legally binding. A wedding ceremony alone created a marriage in name. Consummation confirmed it in law. And the difference mattered enormously, because an unconsummated marriage could be annulled, set aside, treated as if it had never occurred. You can see immediately why this would be a matter of considerable public interest. An annulment on grounds of non-consummation meant the match was void. The property arrangements dissolved. The alliance between the families collapsed. Any children produced in the interim had their status thrown into uncertainty. And in the upper reaches of Tudor society, where marriages joined estates, titles, and dynastic ambitions, the question of whether or not a marriage had been consummated was not a private domestic matter. It was political. It was legal. It was, in some cases, the hinge on which the entire arrangement turned. The witnesses were not there to violate privacy. They were there to provide testimony if the marriage was ever challenged, to confirm, if it came to it, that the couple had been properly placed in bed together, that the ceremony had been conducted, that everything had proceeded as it was supposed to proceed. In the event of a future legal dispute about the marriage's validity, those witnesses might be called upon. Their presence was, in its own way, a form of protection, documentation of an event that could not be undocumented. This logic was sincere. It was also completely indifferent to the experience of the woman in the bed. And then came the morning. The morning after a Tudor wedding night, particularly among noble families, sometimes carried its own expectations. Physical evidence of consummation, evidence the sheets might provide, was in some households considered a legitimate matter of family concern, not universally, not in every home. But the expectation existed, and it was known to exist, and any bride who could not meet it faced real consequences. A woman who could not provide the expected evidence, for whatever reason, whether physical, circumstantial, or simply unlucky in the timing, could face accusations that had nothing to do with honesty, everything to do with the interpretation of a wet sheet by people who had strong opinions about it. The morning after the wedding night was its own form of scrutiny, and you had survived the night only to arrive at it. What the morning actually looked like, in practical terms, varied enormously depending on the household and the social position of the family. In some aristocratic households, there was a formal inspection. The women who had helped the bride prepare the night before would return in the morning to see to her dressing and to manage whatever the night had produced in terms of evidence. In others, the matter was handled less formally, but no less attentively. The information simply moved through the household by other means, reaching the senior members of both families by channels that were understood without being specified. The woman at the centre of this scrutiny had very limited control over the interpretation that would be placed on whatever the morning revealed. Her own testimony about the night was the least reliable evidence in the room. She was considered an interested party, and her account, even if accurate, would be weighed against whatever other evidence was available. This is one of the things that is hardest to communicate about the experience of a Tudor wedding night, not just the physical reality of it, but the epistemological situation. You had been placed in a position where the most intimate experience of your life was subject to external assessment. The question of whether the experience had proceeded as expected was answered not by you, but by the evidence others could examine, the testimony of the witnesses who had been present, the report of the attendants who returned in the morning. Your version of events was part of the record. It was not necessarily the controlling part, and this had consequences that extended long beyond the morning itself. Because the consummation of the marriage was not simply a personal milestone, it was the event that made the marriage legally complete. The ceremony created the marriage in the eyes of the Church. The consummation confirmed it in the eyes of the law. And a marriage that had not been consummated was, under canon law, a marriage that could potentially be dissolved. This is what made the wedding night so much more than a night. An unconsummated marriage left both parties in an uncertain position. It was grounds for annulment, not divorce, which required much more complex proceedings, but an annulment that declared the marriage never to have been fully valid. The property arrangements could be unwound, the alliance could be dissolved, the woman could be returned to her family, no longer a wife, her status in the community permanently complicated by the question of what exactly had and hadn't happened, and whose fault it was. For men at the highest levels of Tudor society, for kings specifically, this legal mechanism became a tool of enormous political consequence. The annulment granted to Henry VIII on the grounds that Catherine's marriage to Arthur had been consummated, or, if Catherine was correct, denied on the grounds that it had not, is the most dramatic example. But it was not unique in kind. The mechanism existed throughout the legal system, available to any party with sufficient resources to pursue it. What this meant for ordinary women was that the wedding night carried a legal freight that went far beyond anything they'd been told to expect. The pressure of the bedding ceremony, the witnesses, the priest's blessing, the morning after, none of this was arbitrary. All of it was, in a legal and social sense, necessary. It was the documentation of an event that the law required to have happened in order for the marriage to be valid. The woman in the bed was being documented. What she experienced in that bed, whether she was afraid or ready or something more complicated than either, was not the point. There is something I find genuinely hard to convey about the cumulative weight of all this. Not any single element, not the ceremony, not the witnesses, not the mourning, not the law, but all of it together. The way it stacked. The way each layer rested on the one beneath it. The way you could, if you tried, trace a line from the betrothal negotiation in the parlour 2 years ago to this particular morning, this particular room, this particular silence after the door opened and the expectations came in. The law had a name for the woman you were now, feme covert, the covered woman, the woman whose legal identity had been covered, folded into, merged with, subsumed entirely by her husband's. From the moment the marriage was consummated and the law recognized it as complete, the bride ceased to exist as an independent legal entity. In the eyes of English common law, a husband and wife were one person, and that person was the husband. The law was very clear about this. It was admirably precise. It left very little room for misunderstanding, which was perhaps its most remarkable quality, given what it was actually saying. As a feme covert, a married woman could not own property independently. Whatever money she had brought to the marriage, her dowry, her savings, any wages she had earned before the ceremony, now belonged to her husband legally. Whatever property she had owned before the wedding, unless it had been placed in a specially constructed trust by a family with the resources and foresight to arrange one, became his. Her clothing, her jewellery, the book she'd been given as a birthday gift, the small parcel of land her grandmother had left her, his. All of it, his. Take a moment with that, not abstractly, specifically. Everything you owned this morning, the dress, the ring you wore to church, the coins in your purse, by this afternoon, it belonged to someone else. You're thinking about what that actually feels like. Good. Keep that feeling. The legal logic didn't stop with property she had owned before the wedding. It extended equally into everything she would do and earn and become during the marriage itself. A woman's earnings during the marriage, any wages she received for any work performed, became her husband's the moment she received them. This was not a technicality buried in an obscure clause. It was the operational reality of coverture, functioning exactly as it was designed to. If a woman took in sewing from neighbours, brewed ale for sale, sold eggs from her household's chickens, or assisted in her husband's trade, the money she received for this work was legally his. She had done the labour. The money was his. No exceptional effort, no particular skill, no unusual volume of work changed the equation. And this applied to you. Every wage you earned, every transaction you completed, every market day where your effort turned into coin, the coin was his the moment it reached your hand. Her debts, on the other hand, were his responsibility. This sounds protective, and in certain ways it was. Creditors could not sue her independently. They had to sue him. But this protection was the opposite face of the same coin. She could not enter into contracts independently, because any obligation she created would fall on her husband, and the law had decided it was simpler to require his involvement from the beginning, rather than have him discover it later. Her correspondence, the letters she sent and received, had no legal protection from his access. There was no concept in Tudor common law of a married woman's private communications. If her husband chose to read her letters, he had the right. If he chose to intercept her correspondence or prevent her from receiving it, the law offered no remedy. The idea that a person's communications belong to them personally, that there is a private sphere even within a marriage, was not a feature of this legal system. Think about what that means in practice. A letter from your sister, a note from a friend, a reply you had been composing in your head for 3 days. He could read all of it. There was no legal ground on which you could object. Her movements were subject to his authority in practical ways the law did not need to specify, because the broader architecture of coverture made them inevitable. A wife who left the household without her husband's approval had, in the eyes of the law, departed from her proper place. A husband who chose to constrain his wife's movements was not, by default, doing anything illegal. The common law courts were not designed to adjudicate the daily texture of a marriage. They were designed to protect property. And in a marriage, her property was his. The children were his. This is perhaps the most quietly devastating element of coverture, the one that gets lost most easily in the larger architecture of legal erasure. A woman who had carried a child through a dangerous pregnancy and survived the delivery, who had nursed and fed and formed the primary relationship with the small person she'd produced at considerable risk to her own life, had no independent legal claim to that child. In the event of a separation, a dispute, or a husband's death that left the children in someone else's guardianship, the father's legal authority was paramount. The mother's rights, in the common law courts, were not simply weaker than his. They were, in a strict legal sense, non-existent. Some women, through the Court of Chancery, managed to negotiate arrangements that gave them practical access to their children in difficult situations. But these were exceptional cases requiring the resources, connections, and social standing that most women did not possess. The ordinary woman, in an ordinary marriage, operated under a legal structure that gave her no formal mechanism to assert a claim to the children she had borne. The law was aware of all of this. It did not consider these facts to be problems. It considered them to be the natural and proper organisation of the household, rooted in scripture and tradition, and the accumulated authority of centuries of legal precedent. The wife was protected. The husband was responsible. The system was orderly. Whether it was just was a question the system did not, as a rule, find it necessary to ask. She could not sue in her own name. She could not be sued in her own name. She could not sign a contract. She could not write a will that disposed of property without her husband's agreement. Not that she had much property left to dispose of, but the principle stood regardless. Before marriage she had been a feme sole, a woman in her own legal right. She could own things, make agreements, conduct business, hold property that was unambiguously hers. She had full legal standing. She was, in the eyes of the law, a person. And then she married, and that ended. That is what the day you walked out of the church actually was, in legal terms. The day your personhood was suspended, not taken away forever, suspended, pending circumstances that might return it. But for the ordinary run of a life, suspended. In exchange, she received her husband's legal protection, his name, his household, his obligation to maintain her, to house her, feed her, clothe her. These were real things, and it would be wrong to dismiss them. In a world where women without male protection faced genuine practical dangers, being covered by a husband's legal identity offered real shelter to many women who might otherwise have had none. But the trade was absolute, and what made it startling, what still makes it startling to sit with, is that you gave up not just specific things, but the entire category of legal agency, every tool, every formal mechanism, every right to act independently in any context, in any court, in any written agreement, exchange for shelter and a ring, and the promise that he would endow you with all his worldly goods, which, given that your worldly goods were now also his, was a somewhat circular arrangement. The wealthy had workarounds. Legal trusts established before the ceremony could shelter certain assets from a husband's automatic claim. The Court of Chancery, which operated on principles of equity rather than strict common law, sometimes offered married women protections the common law courts would not. Wealthy women with powerful families behind them had mechanisms their less fortunate counterparts did not. For most women in Tudor England, those mechanisms simply did not exist. The common law was the only law available to them, and the common law on the subject of married women had the quiet confidence of something that has never seriously been questioned. A husband, by law, was entitled to all money his wife earned during the marriage. He was responsible for her debts. He had the right to physically discipline her within bounds, the courts defined as reasonable, though the courts were themselves composed of husbands, which may have coloured the definition of reasonable in ways that deserve some gentle scrutiny. He had the right to her company, her presence, her compliance. She had the right to his maintenance, and that was, broadly speaking, the balance. The contrast with widowhood, with the legal status of a woman who had simply outlived her husband, is one of the quieter, staggering facts in all of Tudor women's history. A widow became a feme sole again. The moment her husband died, her legal personhood was restored. She could own property outright. She could sue in her own name. She could sign contracts, manage estates, conduct business, refuse to remarry. And in refusing, she could keep the legal independence she'd just recovered. She was, once again, a person in the full legal sense of the word. Many Tudor widows chose exactly that. And this is worth sitting with, because it tells you something about the marriage you had just entered. The only version of it in which the law fully recognised you as a person was the one where your husband was dead. Some of them, managing estates and running businesses and conducting their affairs with full legal independence, were among the most practically powerful women in England. Not because they had done anything exceptional, but because they had outlived their husbands and been given back what was theirs to begin with. There is something in that which I find genuinely difficult to put into words. The idea that legal personhood was not something a woman lost through any fault or failure, but simply because she had married, and that it was returned to her, equally automatically when her husband died. Marriage was the event that erased her. Widowhood was the event that restored her. And between those two events, between the erasure and the restoration, lay everything: the pregnancies, the childbirths, the years in a household she could not legally leave, managing a household she could not legally own, raising children whose legal father could override every decision she made. The wedding night was not the beginning of the story. It was simply the night when the erasure became complete, and everything after it required a particular kind of courage, the quiet kind. The kind that gets up in the morning and does what's needed and never announces itself, because announcing it was never an option. We're going to sit with that courage now. We're going to go into the room where it was needed most: the childbed. The word itself has an old quality to it, something worn smooth by use. Childbed, the bed in which a woman lay down to give birth, and not infrequently did not get up from. This is the fact that sits underneath every other fear in this story. The fear of the wedding night, the fear of the legal erasure, the fear of the unconsummated marriage, and the witnessed bed, and the morning after scrutiny. All of those fears had a shape, a name, a mechanism you could understand and in some cases navigate. The fear of the childbed was different, because the childbed was not something you could negotiate your way around. It was not a law that clever families could circumvent with a trust. It was not a custom that varied between households. It was simply what happened when you became pregnant. And becoming pregnant was, for most married women in Tudor England, not a question of if but when. The statistical reality of childbirth mortality in the 16th century is difficult to pin down with precision. Historical records are incomplete, and death certificates as we understand them did not exist. But the evidence we have suggests that childbirth was, by a significant margin, the most dangerous thing a woman in Tudor England would routinely face. Across the population, the risk of dying in childbirth, or of dying in the weeks immediately following from the infections that could follow a delivery, was real and understood and factored into everyday life in ways that might surprise you. Women wrote their wills before going into labour. Not all women, not in every household. But the practice was well established enough that it doesn't appear in the historical record as anything remarkable. A woman in the later stages of pregnancy putting her affairs in order, specifying what should happen to her belongings, was simply being prudent. She was acknowledging, honestly, that the room she was about to enter carried risks she could not control. The lying-in period added to this. In the weeks before a woman's expected delivery date, she would withdraw from the household, from the public spaces, from her regular duties, from the company of men. She would retire to the lying-in chamber, a room prepared specifically for the birth, hung with thick tapestries and draped against the light and the cold. The windows were often covered. The fire burned constantly. The air grew heavy and warm and close. The thinking behind this was protective. You were sheltering the mother and the child from cold, from draughts, from the unpredictable dangers of the world outside. The practical effect, in a room with sealed windows and a constantly burning fire, and a number of women in close proximity for several weeks, was an environment that we now understand to be somewhat less healthy than its architects intended. Birth, in this world, was entirely female territory. Men, even male physicians, were excluded from the lying-in chamber as a matter of convention. The midwife was in charge. The female attendants were in charge. The experienced women of the household, the older women who had been through it themselves, were in charge. This was not ignorance. These women had genuine skill and genuine knowledge, accumulated across generations of watching and assisting and surviving. They knew what they were doing. They also knew with the same clarity that there were things they could not control, that some labours went wrong in ways that nothing and no one could fix, that the body had its own logic and the logic was not always merciful. You brought what protection you could. Birthing girdles, leather or fabric bands, sometimes embossed with prayers or sacred imagery, were worn or laid across the mother's body during labour. Relics of saints, brought from churches or passed down through families, were placed near the bed. Prayers were said, particularly to St. Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth, who was believed to offer protection to labouring women. Her story involved surviving being swallowed by a dragon and emerging intact, which made her, by the reasoning of the time, an entirely appropriate intercessor for a situation that felt similarly dire. These were not superstitions held by people who didn't know better. They were the best available tools, and the women who used them knew the difference between hope and certainty, even if the distinction wasn't always made explicit. The lying-in chamber itself is worth spending a moment in, not as a fact to be catalogued, but as a room to be understood. The experience of being inside it for several weeks was a significant part of what Tudor pregnancy and childbirth actually felt like from the inside. The tapestries covered the walls and the windows, thick wool shutting out daylight entirely. The fire in the corner was never allowed to die down. The smell in a room like this was a specific one. After several weeks with the windows sealed and a number of women in residence, warm, heavy, layered with wood smoke and the herbs strewn across the floor, and underneath all of it the particular quality of air that has been enclosed against the outside world for a very long time. It is not unpleasant, it is simply particular. It belongs to that room and no other. The women who gathered in the lying-in chamber were not idle during the weeks before the birth. They prepared the supplies the delivery would require: clean linens, warm water, the specific herbal preparations the midwife used. They brewed drinks from pennyroyal and raspberry leaf, from plants whose properties for easing labour and supporting recovery had been handed down through generations of female knowledge, carefully observed and carefully transmitted. They readied the room with the quiet, systematic competence that characterized everything these women did, practiced until it didn't need to announce itself, just done. And then the labour began. The midwife worked from knowledge that was genuinely extensive. She knew how to position a woman for an easier delivery, how to use her hands to help guide a baby presenting at an awkward angle, how to assess the progress of labour from what the body was doing and what the woman's own body was telling her. She had remedies for a labour that was slowing, and she knew when those remedies were working and when the situation had moved beyond what she could manage. The distinction between those two things was the most important clinical judgment of her practice, and she made it regularly in sealed rooms in firelight, with no equipment beyond what her hands could carry and her knowledge could provide. The waiting had its own texture. Hours in a warm, sealed room, surrounded by women you had known your whole life, with the particular quality of time that exists when something enormous is happening and cannot be hurried or stopped, only witnessed. Some labours lasted a few hours, some lasted a day, some considerably longer. The midwife tracked the progress. The attendants held and supported. The prayers were said continuously by someone in the room, taking turns so that the prayers never quite ceased. On the other side of it, for the women who survived, there was something specific in the body. Not wisdom exactly, not the kind that announces itself, just the quiet physical knowledge of having been through something genuinely extraordinary and having come back. The recovery took weeks. The woman remained in the lying-in chamber, cared for by the same community that had supported the birth. She would eventually be churched, formally welcomed back into the life of the parish in a ceremony that marked her return from somewhere difficult. Some women looked forward to the churching primarily because it meant they could leave the sealed chamber and breathe outside air again, which is entirely understandable. Some found in it a genuine spiritual moment, and some did not make it to the churching at all. The fear that a woman carried into the lying-in chamber was not formless. It had a shape, a timeline, a set of physical sensations she had been told to watch for. She knew what a difficult labour looked like from the accounts of women who had survived one. She knew what a fever in the weeks after birth could mean. She had, in many cases, sat with other women during their own deliveries. She had heard the sounds. She had watched the faces. She knew. And knowing, unlike not knowing, does not make fear smaller. It makes it more precise. Every pregnancy, in Tudor England and in the centuries around it, carried the live possibility of death. Not a distant, unlikely, theoretical possibility, a present one, so present that the practical preparations for dying were made as a matter of course before the baby arrived. The will, the instructions for the household, the notes for children who might grow up without their mother and who would need, somehow, to know what she would have said if she had been there to say it. This practice, writing to your child before you knew whether you would survive to meet them, is something we have direct evidence of in this period, and when you encounter it in the historical record, it tends to stop you where you stand. Not everyone who carried that fear put it into writing. Most women left nothing we can read. Their fear exists now only as a silence in the record, a name, a date, a burial entry. The vast majority of what was experienced in lying-in chambers across the 16th century is simply gone. But there are exceptions, and one of them is so clear, so complete, so quietly extraordinary that she gives voice to all the silences around her. Elizabeth Jocelyn was not, strictly speaking, a Tudor woman. She was born in 1596, in the later years of Elizabeth I's reign, and she died in 1622 when the Stuarts had been on the throne for nearly 2 decades. But the world she inhabited, the fears she carried, the practices she followed, the specific, careful dread of the childbed that shaped her pregnancy, had its direct roots in the century before her. The lying-in chamber she entered, the relics placed near the bed, the will she wrote in advance, quietly, without fuss, because that was simply what a prudent woman did. All of it descended in an unbroken line from Tudor England. She is the clearest window we have into what these women felt, because she left us the view. She wrote it in secret. In the months before her baby was due, She was pregnant for the first time, 26 years old, married to Thomas Jocelyn. Elizabeth began to write a book, not a letter in the ordinary sense, a collection of instructions and prayers and carefully considered advice, addressed to her unborn child. She called it the mother's legacy to her unborn child. She worked on it quietly, alone, in the hours when no one was watching, and she said nothing to her husband, nothing to anyone. In the weeks before her due date, she finished it. Then she showed it to Thomas. She told him she was afraid she would die in the childbed. He urged her not to speak of it. He didn't want to hear it. But she pressed the manuscript into his hands. She gave birth to a daughter on the 12th of September 1622. 9 days later she died of puerperal fever. Thomas Jocelyn had the book published in 1624, 2 years after her death. It went through multiple editions. It was read widely. It clearly reached people who recognized something in it, who found, in the careful, loving, practical instructions of a woman writing to a child she wasn't sure she would survive to know, something that mattered. I want you to stay with that for a moment. She wrote to a child whose face she had not yet seen. She gathered everything she wanted her child to understand about faith and conduct and how to move through the world, and she put it on paper in the hours she could find, saying nothing to anyone, because to say it would be to admit what she already knew. What she wrote was not dramatic. That is the most important thing about it. It is not a cry of despair or a formal farewell. It reads, in the passages that survive, like the voice of a woman who is being very careful and very thorough and is trying, above everything else, to be useful. Practical advice about how to pray, instructions about how to conduct oneself toward the people who serve you, the importance of being kind, the importance of being honest, and then, threaded through the practical instructions, the thing underneath them, the acknowledgement that she may not be there, that the child may grow up without the person who is writing this, that these pages are what she can offer in place of herself, and she has thought very carefully about what to put in them, and she has tried to make it enough. There is a particular kind of grief in that, in the gap between "I will teach you this" and "I am writing this down in case I cannot." The gap is very small in Elizabeth Jocelyn's book. It is the gap that the whole document lives in, and she holds it with a steadiness that is not bravery so much as necessity. She does not have the option of not being steady. She has work to do. The book she produced is the size that work was, written in the hours available to her, in a house full of people who didn't know she was writing it. The fear was not irrational. It was not weakness or failure of faith. It was simply accurate. An accuracy in the face of real risk sometimes looks indistinguishable from courage. Most women who died in the childbed left nothing we can read. Elizabeth Jocelyn is the gap made audible. She is the one we can hear. And if you needed a single example that demonstrated just how indifferent the childbed was to rank or wealth or royal protection, Jane Seymour would provide it. Jane Seymour was Henry VIII's third wife. She married him on the 30th of May, 1536, a wedding arranged with some urgency, coming 11 days after the execution of Anne Boleyn. By the accounts of her time, Jane was quiet, careful, and consciously styled as the opposite of the women who had preceded her. Where Anne had been bold, Jane was measured. Where Catherine had been tenacious, Jane was compliant. Henry appeared, by all evidence, to genuinely love her. She gave him what the previous 2 wives had not managed to give him, a son. Edward, later to become Edward VI, was born on the 12th of October, 1537, at Hampton Court Palace. The birth took 3 days. Henry had been waiting years, decades. The heir whose existence would justify everything he had done. The boy for whom he'd broken with Rome and married twice and executed a wife and remade the English church. Edward lived. Jane Seymour died 12 days later, on the 24th of October, 1537. The most likely cause was puerperal fever, the infection that followed so many childbirths, Queen's chambers or otherwise, in the warm, sealed air where it thrived entirely undisturbed. Henry wore black for months. He described her, later, as his true wife. When he died 10 years after her, he was buried beside her at Windsor, by his own request. She had given him the thing he had wanted most in the world, and the thing had killed her. The ward that catches modern eyes is most likely, because even now, 500 years later, we don't know exactly what killed Jane Seymour. The contemporary accounts aren't precise enough. There were conflicting reports. There was speculation at the time about the care she had received in the days after the birth. In some accounts, she was allowed to get out of bed too soon, or given food that was too rich for someone in her condition. None of this can be verified. What can be verified is the date she was born, the date she gave birth, and the date she died. 12 days. That was all the time that passed between the thing she had been afraid of and the thing she had feared happening. Even queens were not exempt. And this, the knowledge that no amount of wealth or rank or royal physicians could reliably stand between a woman and the specific danger of the childbed, was something that every woman who married in Tudor England understood, not as an abstraction, as the weather. You lived with it the way you lived with everything else you couldn't change. And then you got up. You returned to the household. You recovered, if you recovered. You went back to being feme covert, the covered woman, the legal person who did not exist. Back to the marriage that had set all of this in motion. Back to the life that had been arranged, through negotiation and ceremony and the witnessed bed and the blessing of the priest, before you were ever asked what you wanted from it. What did they do with all of that? With the fear that didn't resolve, the dread that didn't lift, the knowledge that everything they had survived might simply be required of them again. I think about you, hearing this, wherever you are, whatever the day has been. There is something in the question that doesn't stay historical for very long. They found ways, within the constraints, inside the walls of the system, using whatever tools were available. There is more to this story than what was done to these women. There is also what they did. I want you to hold both of those things at once, what the system did to them, and what they did anyway. Because the second part is the part the system never fully accounted for. And there are two queens who show us what happened when the question of a wedding night became a matter of state, when the bedroom became the hinge on which English history turned. One of them swore for 30 years that nothing had happened. The other was fairly certain nothing had happened and was considerably relieved about it. Let's begin with Catherine. Catherine of Aragon was not born to be a Queen of England. She was born in 1485 to Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, two of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, and she was raised with the expectation that her marriage would be a matter of the highest political consequence. When she was 3 years old, a treaty was signed arranging her marriage to Arthur, Prince of Wales, the eldest son of Henry VII of England. The negotiations took years. They were exhaustive, detailed, and conducted entirely by people who understood that the stakes were not merely the happiness of 2 children, but the diplomatic relationship between 2 kingdoms. She arrived in England in 1501, aged 15 or 16. She'd spent months at sea and on the road. She did not speak English. She was met with enormous celebration, paraded through London to tremendous crowds, and married to Arthur on the 14th of November 1501 at St. Paul's Cathedral. She had never spoken more than a few words to him before the wedding. The bedding ceremony followed, the guests, the procession, the toasts, the bed. Arthur, aged 15, was put to bed beside his new wife, in the time-honoured fashion, and the curtains were drawn, and the night proceeded as wedding nights were expected to proceed. The next morning Arthur emerged, and, according to accounts preserved in later testimony, he said something to his attendants that would be quoted and argued over for the next 30 years. He said he had been in the midst of Spain. He was thirsty, he said, and asked for ale, because marriage was a good pastime. That quote, in various forms, would be cited as evidence that the marriage had been consummated, that Catherine had been, in the most technical legal sense, Arthur's wife in full. 5 months later, Arthur was dead. He and Catherine had both fallen ill, possibly from sweating sickness, possibly from something else, and Arthur did not recover. He died on the 2nd of April 1502 at Ludlow Castle, at the age of 15, and Catherine was left behind, a widow, a royal widow in a foreign country, with no legal standing of her own, whose entire political purpose had just died with her husband, and whose country was now in a diplomatic conversation about what to do with her. What they eventually did was marry her to Arthur's younger brother, who would become Henry VIII. But before that marriage could happen, before the Pope could issue the necessary dispensation allowing a man to marry his brother's widow, there was a question that had to be answered. Had Catherine and Arthur's marriage been consummated? If it had been consummated, the theological and legal ground for marrying Henry was more complex. If it had not, if Catherine was technically still a virgin, the dispensation was simpler and the second marriage cleaner. Catherine said it had not been consummated. She said this clearly, consistently, and emphatically. She'd been a virgin when she married Henry. Arthur's marriage to her had never been completed in the physical sense. Whatever Arthur had said to his attendants the morning after the wedding was, she maintained, either exaggeration or misreported. The marriage had not been consummated. She said this in 1509 when she married Henry. She said it in the 1520s when Henry began to question the marriage's validity. She said it in the 1530s during the full force of the proceedings that would eventually produce the English Reformation. She said it until the day she died in January 1536, having refused every pressure, every inducement, and every threat to say otherwise. Understand what that actually required. The pressure brought to bear on Catherine of Aragon was not subtle, and it was not brief. It was sustained over nearly a decade, escalating steadily, applied by the most powerful man in England with the full resources of the state behind him. Henry wanted the marriage dissolved. His advisers wanted her to cooperate. The entire machinery of Henrician government was deployed. The lawyers, the theologians, the diplomats, the agents who visited her, all of them working toward a single outcome, that she would accept the dissolution of the marriage, acknowledge her status as the Dowager Princess of Wales rather than Queen, and by accepting both, confirm that the original marriage had been what Henry said it was. She refused. I want you to hold that for a moment. Sit with what it cost. Not as an abstraction, as a person in a series of rooms over a series of years saying the same thing, not once, repeatedly, through years of isolation and the removal of her household staff, through the separation from her daughter, Mary, who was declared illegitimate once the marriage was annulled, a separation Catherine found devastating and which her supporters found politically strategic in their pressure on her. Through the process of being moved from house to house, each one smaller and less comfortable than the last, ending at Kimbolton Castle, where she lived in the final years of her life in deliberate neglect, while Henry married Anne Boleyn, and the English Church was reshaped around the question of his right to do so. She could have accepted. The costs of accepting would have been real. The permanent acknowledgement that her marriage to Henry had been invalid. The permanent delegitimization of her daughter. But the material costs of refusing were equally real, and she lived with those costs for years. And every year, every move, every visit from another envoy asking her to change a single word, she said no. You can decide what you think that required. Courage is one word for it. Stubbornness is another. I think it was both. She was 50 years old when she died at Kimbolton in January 1536. She'd been Queen of England, the real Queen, in her own understanding, and in the understanding of most of Catholic Europe, for 24 years. She'd been set aside for 6. She'd refused throughout those 6 years to accept a position that she understood to be built on a lie. And her position was simple. She had been a virgin when she married Henry. Her first marriage had not been consummated. The dispensation was valid. The marriage to Henry was valid. She was queen. She was not going to say otherwise. Whether she was telling the truth is, as I said, a question historians continue to debate. What is not debated is the consistency and the courage of the position she maintained. In the face of everything that could be brought against her, and nearly everything was eventually, she did not change her testimony. She did not soften it. She did not allow the word probably or perhaps to enter it. What happened on the night of the 14th of November, 1501, she said, was this: nothing. And she died saying it. The question of whether she was telling the truth is one that historians have debated ever since. The evidence on both sides is real. Arthur's reported boast exists. Catherine's consistent testimony exists. The medical understanding of the time, the physical evidence available, the circumstances of those 5 months, all of it has been examined, and scholars continue to reach different conclusions. But here is what matters for our purposes. The answer to the question, what happened in that bedchamber on the night of the 14th of November, 1501, had consequences that rippled outward for the next 4 decades. The validity of Catherine's marriage to Henry, the legitimacy of their daughter, Mary, the break with Rome, the English Reformation, the dissolution of the monasteries, the remaking of a national church. All of it, in some sense, hangs on what happened behind a curtained bed in 1501, and whether the people outside that curtain heard the truth. That is the weight a wedding night could carry. The second queen offers a different kind of story. She is, in my honest assessment, one of the most underrated women in the entire Tudor period. And I say that with the full awareness that the Tudor period contains a remarkable concentration of formidable women. Anne of Cleves. Anne of Cleves arrived in England in December 1539. The match had been arranged for diplomatic reasons. Henry needed an alliance with the Protestant princes of Germany, and Anne's brother William, Duke of Cleves, was a useful friend to have. A portrait was commissioned from Hans Holbein the Younger, one of the most skilled painters in Europe at the time, and sent to Henry so he could assess his prospective bride at safe distance. Henry liked the portrait. He agreed to the match. What he had not fully accounted for was the difference between a painting and a person. Anne of Cleves was born in 1515, the fourth child of John III, Duke of Cleves, and she was 24 years old when she arrived in England to marry Henry. She spoke no English and no French, the two languages Henry was most comfortable in. She could read and write in German. She'd been raised in a conservative German court where music and dancing, pursuits Henry was famously enthusiastic about, were considered rather frivolous for a noblewoman of her standing. She was accomplished in needlework. She was composed, careful, and entirely unprepared for what she was walking into. Henry rode out to meet her at Rochester before the official reception. He had a habit of meeting prospective wives in disguise, apparently on the theory that they would recognize his essential magnificence through whatever costume he was wearing. Anne, not having been briefed on this particular tradition, did not respond with the rapture he expected. She was polite. She was confused. She'd been watching the bear baiting outside the window and was uncertain who this large, insistent stranger was. Henry left. He was not in good spirits. His complaints to Thomas Cromwell, who had arranged the match and whose political future was accordingly entangled with its success, were extensive. He had expected someone magnificent and found, he said, something very different. He called her nothing fair. He questioned the portrait. He said that on the wedding night, which proceeded regardless on the 6th of January 1540, with all the ceremony the occasion required, he had been unable to complete the marriage. She was, he said, not as he had expected. He had suspicions about her virtue. He had concerns he would not specify precisely, though he was not shy about specifying them to Cromwell. Whether these concerns reflected reality, or reflected a 48-year-old king who had convinced himself that the fault lay with the woman, rather than with his own health and expectations, is a question the historical record leaves diplomatically open. The marriage lasted 6 months. In July 1540, it was annulled on grounds of non-consummation. Anne accepted the annulment, and here is where Anne of Cleves becomes genuinely remarkable. She accepted, and then she negotiated. In the settlement that followed, Anne of Cleves received Richmond Palace. She received Hever Castle, which had been, not without a certain irony, the childhood home of Anne Boleyn. She received an annual income of £4,000, which was significant. She received several other properties and the title of the king's beloved sister. She was welcomed at court on occasions that suited her. She did not remarry. She's reported to have danced when she heard the news. Let's stay with her for a moment, because the life she built afterward is worth attending to. Anne of Cleves did not slink back to Germany in defeat. She stayed in England. She had negotiated for an English life, and she was going to live one. She kept her properties. Richmond Palace became her primary residence, a fact that she appears to have found satisfactory. She kept her income. She kept the title. She received visitors at court on terms that suited her. She was treated with the courtesy owed to someone who was, by the legal and social conventions of the day, the king's beloved sister. She was not, in other words, punished for failing to produce the kind of wedding night Henry had required. This is, in the context of Henry's marriages, a remarkable outcome. Catherine of Aragon, who refused to cooperate with the dissolution of her marriage, died in diminished circumstances at Kimbleton, separated from her daughter and stripped of her title. Anne Boleyn, who had failed in a different way, had been executed 11 days before Henry married Jane Seymour. Catherine Howard, who would follow Anne of Cleves, would follow Anne Boleyn to the block in 1542. Catherine Parr would survive by the narrowest of margins. Anne of Cleves outlasted all of them, not through brilliance or political manoeuvring of the grand kind. She was not playing chess against Henry. She was simply being absolutely clear-eyed about what she had, what she could obtain, and what it would cost her to try for more. When the annulment was offered, she understood it for what it was, not an insult to survive, but an opportunity to accept. The marriage had not been what either party wanted. The annulment was the door back to something better. She walked through it with her income intact and her properties arranged and her freedom secured, and then she went home to Richmond Palace, and apparently had a reasonably pleasant life for the next 17 years. And I want you to notice what she did with that time. Not what she became famous for, just what she did. Quietly, practically. As a person who had been handed back her own life and decided to use it, she learned English. She developed a taste for English food and English fashions, which she wore with what contemporary accounts suggest was genuine pleasure. She was liked. Those who encountered her after the annulment found her warmer and more at ease than the reports of her arrival in England had suggested. The woman who'd been introduced to England as a diplomatic transaction turned out, once the diplomatic transaction was concluded, to have a personality that people enjoyed spending time with. She had been, in the system of Tudor marriage, an object, a piece in a diplomatic arrangement, assessed by portrait, delivered by convoy, placed in a bed beside a man who found her inadequate, and told Cromwell so the morning after. She had no say in any of it, and then, by the specific gravity of the situation and her own careful navigation of it, she became a subject again, a person with a house and an income and choices about how to spend her days. Henry VIII died in January 1547. Anne of Cleves outlived him by 10 years, dying in July 1557, the last of Henry's 6 wives to survive, having kept her income and her independence and her title, having navigated a situation that would have destroyed most people. I find that entirely reasonable. The woman who failed to have a wedding night ended up with 2 palaces, a pension, and 17 years of freedom. The system that was supposed to cover her, erase her, fold her into the identity of a man who couldn't stand the sight of her, somehow through her own careful handling of the situation, did nothing of the kind. She worked with what she had. She was good at it, which, when you step back from the specific details of these 2 queens and look at the larger pattern, is exactly what most Tudor women were doing, in quieter circumstances, without the diplomatic leverage or the royal income. They worked with what they had. They were very good at it. The word that comes up again and again when you read closely about the daily experience of married women in Tudor England is not despair. It's not even endurance, though endurance is there. The word that keeps emerging is management. These women managed. They managed their households, their relationships, their finances as far as they could reach them, their situations. Not with the formal tools the law had removed from them. They didn't have those anymore. With everything else. A woman running a substantial household in Tudor England was responsible for a genuinely complex operation. She managed servants, sometimes dozens of them. She managed the food supply, the linen stores, the medicines, the guests, the correspondence. She managed the social relationships that connected the household to the community around it. The visits, the gifts, the favours, the obligations. She knew who owed whom what. She knew which servants could be trusted with which responsibilities. She knew what the silence of a particular person at a particular moment probably meant. This was real power, not formal, not legal, but the kind of practical power that has no name because it was never acknowledged by the people who wrote the laws. In many households it was enormous. The networks that supported this were extensive. Women visited each other. They wrote letters. The correspondence that survives between women in Tudor England is a remarkable document of mutual support, practical exchange, and the kind of specific useful intelligence that rarely makes it into official records. They shared information about remedies and household management and difficult situations and what to do when the formal systems offered nothing. You talked, you wrote, you visited, you built relationships with the people around you who understood what you were dealing with. Some women controlled the household accounts in ways that gave them real influence over how money was spent, even without formal authority over it. Some maintained small personal savings outside the main accounting, technically not permitted under coverture but widely practiced and rarely examined. Some built reputations through consistent, competent management that protected them in ways no legal document could. You built your protection through reputation, through competence, through the steady, patient accumulation of relationships and obligations that meant the people around you had a stake in your welfare. This was not justice. It was not the same as having legal rights. But it was something, and in the absence of the other thing, something was what you worked with, and you would have worked with it. That's what the record shows, over and over, not passive endurance, active navigation, the specific daily practical intelligence of someone who knows the terrain and has decided to move through it anyway. The merchant class offered rather more flexibility. In some trades, the custom of the borough permitted a married woman to trade in her own name. This applied where her husband was in a different business, a category called feme sole trader. It granted her the right to enter contracts, to sue and be sued as if she were unmarried. The gap between this and the strict theory of coverture is instructive. The law said one thing, daily commercial life required another, and where those two things diverged, women found room to move. The trades where this applied were specific: silk weaving in London, certain areas of retail, the innkeeping trade where the wife was frequently the practical manager of the establishment while the husband was occupied elsewhere. In each case, the economic necessity of women's active participation in commerce had forced a gap in the legal theory, a recognised exception that acknowledged, without quite admitting it, that coverture in its strict form was simply incompatible with how commercial life actually functioned. These women kept accounts, they negotiated with suppliers, they extended credit to customers and collected on debts. They made decisions about stock and pricing and staffing and the 100 daily choices that running a business required. They did all of this while being, in the strict legal theory, a person who could not act independently. The contradiction was never resolved. It was simply lived, and the letter writing. I want to return to this because the correspondence that survives between women in Tudor England is one of the most remarkable bodies of evidence we have for what their daily lives actually felt like. And it is consistently underread relative to the official documents that sit beside it. Women wrote to each other about practical things: the price of wool in the local market, a remedy for a particular kind of fever that is working well in the household, the character of a servant who was about to enter a new position and whose new employer had written to ask for a reference, whether a particular legal dispute might be resolved through the intervention of a mutual acquaintance, what to do about a tenant who had fallen behind on rent and whose family were known to be in genuine difficulty. These letters were also sometimes about things that were harder to put into words. A woman writing to a sister or a cousin who was about to marry, not with explicit advice about what to expect, but with a warmth and a specific kind of care in the language that carried its own message. I am thinking of you. I remember. You're not alone in this. The networks built through this correspondence were functional in ways that had no formal legal existence. A woman who had been corresponding for years with a network of female connections across several counties had access to information, assistance, and support that was genuinely valuable, even if none of it was recognised by the courts as constituting an interest she could enforce. She knew who to write to when she needed a favour. She knew whose husband could influence which outcome. She knew which households were likely to be sympathetic to a particular kind of request. She knew things that the official record could never acknowledge she knew. Widowhood, when it came, offered something more formal, the femme sole again, legal personhood restored, and a significant number of Tudor widows, having recovered their legal standing, chose to keep it. They managed their estates, they ran their businesses, they declined the offers that came. And offers often came because the life on the other side of remarriage was one they understood with great clarity, and they had already done it once, and they had survived it, and they were not in a hurry to go back. The widows who managed significant estates were not anomalies. They appear throughout the Tudor record. Women managing properties, directing agricultural operations, conducting legal disputes, corresponding with royal officials, making decisions that affected not just their own households, but the communities around them. They were doing this not because they were exceptional, but because the death of a husband had returned to them what was theirs to begin with, and they were simply using it. Some of the most detailed and capable household accounts from the Tudor period were kept by widows. The documentation, the organisation, the clear-sighted management of complex situations. It is there in the records for anyone who looks. It was always there. It just required the removal of the legal obstacle that had been keeping it from view. Some of them thrived. Not because the system had been generous to them, but because they had learned, across years of navigating a system that was not designed in their favour, exactly how to work within it. And when the system finally released them, through widowhood, through the death of a husband who might have been kind or cruel or simply absent, they used what they had learned. Fear and competence can live in the same person. So can dread and capability. So can the knowledge that everything is arranged against you, and the practical intelligence to navigate it anyway. These women had all of those things. And tonight, in this quiet, in this particular darkness that you're resting in right now, I want to put the analysis down for a moment and just let them exist. The women who stood at the church door and knew exactly what they were walking into. The women who sat in the lying-in chamber and prayed to St. Margaret and also, simultaneously, gave instructions to their servants because the household still needed to run, even while they were afraid. The women who wrote to children they weren't sure they'd survive to meet. They were afraid. They were also completely, specifically, quietly extraordinary. And the candle on the dressing table, the one that was burning the night they were put into the bed, the one that they could see through the curtains, small and steady and indifferent to everything happening around it, that candle is still here in some sense. In the fact that we're talking about them, in the fact that you're listening. Let's slow down now. You've covered a lot of ground tonight. A great deal of it was difficult ground, and I think it deserves a moment. Not a conclusion, exactly. Not a tying up, but a slowing, a breathing out. The kind of quiet that comes at the end of a long walk when you finally stop and look back at where you've been. Close your eyes, if you want. The room you're in right now is different from the rooms we've been visiting. There are no candles, there is no wood smoke, there are no negotiations taking place in the parlour below, no priest waiting to say words over a bed, no guests gathering at the end of the corridor. The rooms we visited are quiet now. The people in them are resting. You can rest too. Not yet all the way. Not quite. There's one more thing I want to give you before we get there. The women of Tudor England knew something that I think we have a harder time accessing than we realise. They knew, specifically viscerally in a way that shapes how you walk through a day, that the things most worth having are also the things most threaded with risk. Marriage was safety and danger, both. Pregnancy was continuation and loss, both. Love was a thing that existed inside a system that made no allowance for it, and it existed there anyway, stubbornly, abundantly, in the letters and the small gifts, in the female gatherings on the night before the wedding, where the comfort on offer was simply this: we are here. They held the fear and the love in the same hands, both at once. They didn't have the option of separating them. There is something in that which I think we forget when life gets smooth enough that it seems like risks and gifts should be discrete categories, should not touch, should be distinguishable from each other. They are not. Always, they were not then. The women who went into the lying-in chamber carrying the fear and the love together, who prayed to St. Margaret and also gave instructions to the household, and also held the thought of the child they were hoping to meet. Those women were not failing to be afraid. They were not succeeding at being brave. They were simply being both, because that is what the situation required. And the situation required it repeatedly. Every pregnancy, every year in a household that was not legally yours, every time the door opened. What they had that sustained them was each other. This keeps coming back, and I want to name it clearly, because I think it's the thing that gets lost most easily in the narrative of female suffering. The female networks, the female friendships, the women who gathered the night before the wedding to offer company and the truth of their survival, the women who sat in the lying-in chamber and held the mother's hand, the women who wrote letters and visited and shared what they knew and covered for each other and kept each other's secrets and occasionally, quietly, very effectively, made each other's lives more bearable. They were the infrastructure that the law had forgotten to account for. The law said a married woman was covered, invisible, merged into someone else. The law said she had no independent existence. And then, right in the middle of all of that, running underneath it like a river under ice, were these networks, this knowledge, this accumulated, generational, quietly ferocious female solidarity that the law could not see because the law had never learned to look for it. It didn't need to be named. It didn't need to be formal. It just needed to exist, and it did, reliably, in every household and every neighbourhood and every church community across the whole of Tudor England. You are not alone. We are here. That is very old comfort. It is not less true for being old, and now we are getting close to the end. The candle is burning lower. The night outside is quiet in the way that nights get very late, when the last of the noise has settled, and even the household animals have stopped moving. The room is warm. It's also dark. This is the best kind of dark. The earned kind. The kind that follows a long attention. You have paid attention tonight to something worth paying attention to, and your body knows it, and it is starting to make the transitions that bodies make when they're ready to let the mind rest. Your breathing is slower than it was an hour ago, maybe 2 hours. You might not have noticed it happening. That's how it usually goes. The thoughts are getting softer now, less sharp. They're not demanding anything from you. They're just moving, the way thoughts do when the hold on them loosens, drifting rather than arriving. The women we talked about tonight are quiet. They're not gone. Good history doesn't go. But they are resting now in the part of your mind where the things you care about settle when the day is done. They'll be there tomorrow. They're always there, once you've looked. Let yourself go further into this quiet. Notice what your body is doing right now, the weight of it, wherever you're lying. The specific warmth that has collected in the places you've been still the longest. The way the breath moves without you making it move. In and out, in and out. The particular automaticity of a body that has decided it is safe enough to let the process run on its own for a while. This is the body's version of trust. You don't think about breathing, you let it happen. You've given that over. There are other things you can give over tonight in the same way. The thinking, the processing, the mild background pressure of having to hold things in mind. They don't need to be held right now. The women we've been with tonight, they're not asking you to hold them. They have been held, in the record, for 500 years, by historians who read their letters, by archivists who catalogued their household accounts, by the odd scholar who looked at a marriage contract or a will, or a lying-in preparation list and thought, there is a person in here, not a legal abstraction, a person. They have been held. You can put them down for the night. The thoughts that are still moving, let them move. Don't follow them. This is a particular skill of the very tired. The thought arrives, you observe it, you don't pursue it. It drifts across and out the other side of your attention. Another one comes, you observe it. It goes. This is not concentration. This is the opposite of concentration. This is the gradual loosening of the hold. Your jaw, if you notice it, let it soften. The muscles that keep the face organized for the day, for the expressions the day requires, they can let go now. No one is watching. No one needs anything from you tonight. Your shoulders, if they're carrying anything, let them drop. Just a fraction. The posture of a person who's put something down. There is a moment, somewhere between waking and sleeping, that is neither. A kind of threshold place. The sounds of the room are still there, but they've become less specific. The particular shape of them has softened into something more like texture than information. The thoughts are still there, but they've stopped meaning quite as much. The images arrive and leave without explanation, and you don't ask for one. You're very close to that place right now. Don't try to reach it. Trying closes the door. Just let the quiet carry you toward it, the way quiet always does, if you let it. The room is softening. You are softening. You don't need to do anything with what you've heard tonight. Not yet. You don't need to process it or categorize it or produce anything from it. The mind does its work in the spaces between, in the sleep, in the slow morning hours before full waking, in the glances back across a day when something surfaces that you've been carrying without knowing it. The work will happen on its own. For now, just this. The dark, the warmth, the particular softness of a room very late at night when there is nothing left to do. You've earned this. Let the breath go long and slow, in and out. The things we've covered tonight, the negotiations and the contracts and the ceremony and the law and the fear and the courage and the small private acts of survival, they don't need you to hold them consciously right now. They will keep. The history has been kept for 500 years. It will keep a few more hours, and somewhere in a narrow house in Tudor England, or in a great manor on a cold evening in November, or in a modest chamber attached to a merchant's house in the city, a woman is lying very still. She has done what was required of her. She has done it with the knowledge she carried and the company she had and the tools available to her. She has prayed or not prayed. She's been afraid and also ready. She's breathing slowly now. She doesn't know you're here, of course. She doesn't know that 500 years later someone will be listening to her story in the dark, tired, warm, getting quieter by the moment. She doesn't know any of that. But I think she would find it useful to know that she was heard. I think she would find it useful to know that the fear and the courage and the love she carried alongside all of it, that those things were not invisible, that someone looked, that the silence was not the end of it. She was here. You are here. And in the quiet between those two facts, in the 500 years of silence that the women of Tudor England crossed, through all the letters and the wills and the household accounts, in all of that something persists. It persists because the record is there for anyone who looks, because a handful of historians looked and wrote down what they found, and other historians read those findings and added to them, and the chain of attention has not broken. Because Elizabeth Jocelyn's book was published and read and reprinted and has sat in libraries for 400 years waiting to be picked up. Because the marriage contracts still exist in archives, the ink faded but the numbers legible, the jointure figures still recording what a family thought their daughter's widowhood was worth. Because you are here listening in the dark, which means the chain of attention is still holding. You don't need to do anything with this. You don't need to research Tudor women or visit an archive or read a history book, though you are welcome to do all of those things, and the links below will help you start. You don't need to produce anything from tonight. You just need to let the quiet settle around it, the way quiet settles around things worth keeping. The woman in the narrow house, in the great manor, in the merchant's chamber, she's resting now. She has done what was asked of her. So have you tonight. Let the room get darker. Let the breathing slow. The candle is out now. The curtains are still. The room is the softest dark there is. You can sleep. If you found this useful or moving, or if it gave you something you're still turning over, there are links below to some of the history I've drawn on tonight. Elizabeth Jocelyn's book is real. The legal history of coverture is real. The women are real. They always were. Good night.